I think this is one of my sloppier ones, unfortunately. Quote, the court case Standing Bear versus Crook. Because Indians, Native Americans, were not allowed to leave their reservations without permission, Standing Bear and his followers were labeled a renegade band. Standing Bear, his son had died, and he wanted to bury him in their ancestral homeland, which was not the reservation. It was in the Black Hills. He wanted to go north and bury his son. He was told that he couldn't leave the reservation. He did anyway, he and a small troop. The army, on the order of the Secretary of the Interior, arrested them, took them to Fort Omaha, the intention being to return them to Indian Territory. General George Crook, however, sympathized with Standing Bear and his followers and asked Thomas Henry Tibbles, an Omaha newspaperman, to help. Tibbles took up the cause and secured two prominent Omaha attorneys to represent Standing Bear. The lawyers filed a federal court application for a writ of habeas corpus to test the legality of the detention, basing their case on the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. The government disputed the right of Standing Bear to obtain a writ of habeas corpus on the grounds that an Indian was not a person under the meaning of the law. I think at this point they were not citizens. They could not citizen themselves. Another quote, considered by many historians to be the Army's greatest Indian fighter, George Crook earned that reputation by developing a respect for his enemy that carried over into his relationships with Native Americans off the battlefield as well. What he said was, when they were pushed beyond endurance and would go on the warpath, we had to fight them when our sympathies were with them, Crook later said. So, the hostiles, parallels to now. Who were these fellows, Crook and Tibbles? Crook is the greatest Indian fighter yet. Imagine, he seemed an ordinary man of his culture. He however, felt great sympathy for the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Apache, perhaps in a woke way. I don't know. I think not. I think warrior respects warrior. But then a woke warrior would have you quaking, wouldn't she? Warrior respects warrior where civilians do not respect anything but fear. And the civilian thirst for blood, rooted in civilian fear, is our darkest tendency and will never be gainsaid because most of us are civilians. The Standing Bear story is astonishing in any time. This is the thing that I was trying to get to. And I believe this has happened in Palestine. I believe that since 1948, Israeli generals have said, if I were Palestinian, I would revolt also, which is interesting because I think in that humanity, the humanity of that notion of being a human being and empathizing, watching a people suffer, being oppressed, even when your job is to stop them from rebelling, you can still see their point. And I think into that rational void, because that leaves you with a void, you're strapped. Into that void pours Deuteronomy and says, do not be concerned, they are idol worshippers. You can kill them without rebuke. And it seems to me that people who live a real existence, people who defend themselves, in a sense, warriors, essentially become atheists, or on any real level they become atheists. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull were deeply religious men. They were viewed as shamanic. Crazy Horse in particular was I mean, he had a sort of Jesus streak in him. He'd wander off into the wilderness and commune with the spirits. When he was lost, he was understood to be a deeply introverted man. Anyway, I would personally deeply wish to see the Crazy Horse story movie made by Indians from their perspective. Yeah. He is an archetype. He was massively religious, like Crook. The pagan and the Christian bonded in spirituality, probably a lot of things in common between the two faiths. A lot of things in common. Behaviors, no. Rites, no. Rituals, no. But the essentials would have been very similar, and I think that's extremely useful in this horrific condition that we live in at the moment. The white men in this film should be supports, not Kevin Costner, not the usual. The tragedy, perhaps the same tragedy, has been hinted at in Lawrence of Arabia, but my story of that episode would be the story of Faisal, or even Auda Abu Tai, in which Lawrence is the support, he's the outsider. These ghost men, perhaps real men, whose battlefields bring them wisdom, and the tragedy to me is obvious. Civilian needs overwhelm, and no more crooks or Saladins or crazy horses are born. For most of my life, it seems we had overcome. Each war not being like they used to be, but I think that was a natural lie because we all needed to believe it. The violence has not diminished. It has just centralized differently. 274 US soldiers died at the Little Bighorn. It's this turning point in certainly in American history. Indians between 32 and 100. So under 400 total max men died that day. Maybe the Sundance worked, maybe that really, really gruesome thing. Maybe flagellation does too, for some thing, to some effect. So we have some choices. Lethal violence is what we need to do, or we can do something else. But we got to do something. Lying to ourselves about what we are has failed. Thou shalt not, but thou dost. To me, the civilian has to allow here, but they cannot. They have no path to wisdom. Crooks says to Sitting Bull, your day is done. If you want to survive, you must go on the reservation where you can learn the ways of the civilian. You assimilate, which destroyed Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. There was no assimilation both ways. A way of life was being rubbed out, without question. And ways of life, there were hundreds of tribes, and they each had quite a distinct way of life. Unlike Europe, it's quite unique about the Americas, and it may be the same in the Asian plateau, the steppe land. I don't know. We only have what we're told, but Western civilization is incredibly cohesive, for good, for better, or for worse. A way of life was being rubbed out. A genocide was being committed. Only a civilized Westerner needs a vast body count to speak of genocide. It is why the West does not understand genocide as a value they hold dear. It is a culture of obedience, a land of laws that enforces this obedience. We forget so casually the millions of buffalo that fat white men on trains shot for something important to them. Did it arouse them? The instrument of genocide was actually white sport, the killing of the buffalo. It killed a way of life. It killed a lot of people too. They died of starvation because that was their food source. Partly intentional. Even today we cannot choose. European civilization demands a heavy price for its protections. It fosters cowardice, giving into fear and cousin superstition. I don't need us all, and I don't need us all to be Achilles to be men. Bob Dylan met Hurricane Carter. Apparently they scrutinized each other, they studied each other, each saying of the other, he was something, he had a mission in life. They encountered each other in that sense. Not one person, not the white person saying, well, let me be your savior, let me have sympathy with you. Dylan apparently looked into this man, a concept we don't have anymore. In the Sundance, the terrifying ritual of the Oglala, as they dance in agony, they give away belongings. As it were, they cleanse themselves of vanities, I guess. I intellectually explain, I Westernly categorize, though Tom Holland points out there is a streak of this in monasteries. It's called flagellation. So do I hear the protesting Israeli general? Is it all on Miko Peled? I have heard of the brave men who fought for Israel say, if I were Palestinians, I'd do what they do. I can't remember who or where, I could look it up. It is always the civilian who forgets the history, the little bighorn, the washita, the wounded knee, the rosebud, the Persepolis, the Amritsar, the Milai, and so easily Guantanamo. It is a distinct civilian who says, I am an animal too. We cringe and send our boys and girls off to fight for our right to cringe. I have a strange wish growing that Palestinians and Israelis and Ukrainians would stop mid-fusillade and look at the Americans, the English, the French and the Germans and say, what are you looking at, you pathetic lot, vicariously grinding teeth and tutting? Here, you shoot. Yes, that is the trigger. Shoot. Throw that first stone, you sickening civilian. Do we need wars to have warriors? I don't know. We need some mechanisms to grow ourselves, define ourselves, to become Crazy Horse and a General Cook. Maybe some billionaire could fund a study. When the great James O'Brien is confronted every time with the same response to Gaza from men on his call-in show in London, when these reedy men repeat the same phrases, cliches, they have not resisted for half a century, you gotta wonder if civilization is genociding itself, is rubbing out the intuition we're all born with and learning to condemn in school.